Hi everyone, and welcome to the webinar accompanying the research paper Protecting Forests in Indonesia, Legal Options in Land Zoned for Agriculture, with me, Hannah Timmins. This research began when a TFT client raised a concern around protecting set-aside areas for conservation inside their concession. The client brought our attention to a law which stated that companies are legally only allowed to set aside 10% of their concessions for conservation. Breaching this, companies could face penalisation through fines and even the revoking of permits. We wanted to understand this law better, along with any other legal challenges for protecting HCVs and HCS inside concessions. These challenges were delineated in the first chapter of this webinar. We also wanted to provide TFT members and other no deforestation committed companies with support on navigating legal frameworks in Indonesia to get these areas under protection rights. This section of the webinar is Chapter 2, where I'll be walking you through the decision tree that we developed for companies and even NGOs, communities and government wishing to protect areas of land slated for agriculture. Ultimately, our aim is that companies should be able to avoid simply relinquishing these forests and instead contribute to actively protecting Indonesia's natural resources. As I mentioned, the first webinar presented some of the legal challenges that people are currently facing trying to get HCV areas or HCS forest on APL under protection, and what programs the government are currently rolling out to try and counter these challenges. In the last webinar, we also went over some of the basics of agrarian law in Indonesia, including key terminology and a breakdown of the various governing bodies for different land classifications in Indonesia. As we don't want to waste too much time in this webinar, if you're not already familiar with these terms and these classifications, I'd recommend that you re-watch the first webinar and then come back to this one to learn a bit more. In this webinar, we're really going to be focusing on the decision tree at the end of the paper, how to get these areas under legal protection using the current legal framework available in 2018. And as this can kind of be a dry topic, we're going to try and bring it to life using some real case studies from around Indonesia. Before we launch into the decision tree, I just want to clarify a few points. This decision tree represents the quickest, simplest ways of getting these areas under protective management whilst following free, prior and informed consent principles, FPIC principles. The intention of this decision tree is to help companies to actively contribute to the protection of HCV areas or HCS forests that they find within their concession. But the tree can also be used by NGOs, communities and even government to navigate how to get these areas of APL under legal protective status. The decision tree is also not prescriptive, and your use of it can depend on a bunch of different factors, including any interest from local communities in supporting protection, the size and percentage of the area for conservation, any classifications of the land, and also any government support that you've already garnered. Depending on these factors, you might wish to skip steps or jump straight to solutions that you think fit your situation. It's also worth noting here that at this stage, we couldn't include everything in the paper. There are a few key areas that were outside the scope of this research. For example, financing options for conservation like REDD+ or payment for ecosystem service schemes, and also the various different types of community conservation management options. It's recommended that while you work through this decision tree, you're also conducting research into financing options and community management plans in parallel. So there are two things you need to know about the first section of this decision tree. The first is that it takes place between the Izin Lokasi or location permit and the HGU or business right to use permit, as we see this as being the ideal time to map conservation areas and secure their protection. So that's what these dark pink boxes are on the right, although you can also use this retrospectively as well if you're already at the HGU stage. The second thing you need to know is that communities really are at the front and center of this approach. We believe that if communities are empowered with the knowledge, rights and the appropriate support, they are always going to be the most effective custodians of protected areas. So the first step is to work out how these lands are classified. Is it Kawasan Hooten or forest zone, or is it APL? As we saw in the last webinar, really a palm oil plantation should be on APL legally, but this is not always the case. And this is really going to determine what kind of conservation options are available to you. The second step is to understand whether the local communities, if there are local communities, are indigenous. This is critical because if they are indigenous, they may have claim to Hooten Adat rights or traditional forests, which I'll come to in a minute. Then the recommendation is to follow the HCS toolkit, demarcate community lands, production lands, and protection lands through participatory conservation planning. Here, it's worth noting that whilst analysing the challenges in protecting lands, we found that just this process of securing a hagayu is under a strict time limit and presents its own kind of challenges. A company has a maximum of 4 years between being granted an Ijin Lokasi to securing the hagayu, in which they have to map community lands, conduct an environmental impact assessment or AMDAL, and develop and agree on a participatory management plan with communities. If you're following free, prior and informed consent principles correctly, this could take a lot longer than 4 years. In addition, there are also incentives for companies to secure as much of the community lands as possible and as quickly as possible, which is kind of antagonistic to the FPIC approach and often means that critical steps here are rushed. So, through the participatory conservation planning, you will have found out by now if the community wants to manage this area as conservation land. The best case scenario is that they do. As was already mentioned, if communities are empowered with the knowledge, the rights and the appropriate support, they are always going to be the most effective custodians of protected areas. Note here that this may also require some support from the company in terms of direct financing or sourcing financing or legal support for communities to gain tenure. Okay, so through your engagements and your consultations with community, you should by now have some kind of idea of whether or not they're considered indigenous. AMAN, the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of Indonesia, define indigenous peoples as communities that live on customary areas, have sovereignty over land and natural resources, and for whom social cultural life is governed by customary law and customary institutions that sustain their lives as indigenous communities. So if the community is considered indigenous, they can apply for Hooten Adat or traditional forest. Now this is essentially land ownership and can be on Kawasan Hooten or APL. In addition, there's no limit to the percentage of the Hooten Adat that can be forested. At the time of writing, President Jokowi's administration had just recognised the first 9 Hooten Adat claims, totalling 13,100 hectares. And Aman believed that there might be an additional 8.2 million hectares of potential Hooten Adat claims for Indonesia's 60 million indigenous people. At this time, there was also no published guidance on how to apply for Hooten Adat, but with Aman communities applying for more and more, this should change in the future. If the community is not considered indigenous, their management options are dependent on whether the land is Kawasan Hooten or APL. If the land is Kawasan Hooten, the company can support them in a claim for Hutan Desa, village forest, or Hutan Kemasyarakatan, community forest. These are both extendable 35-year management licenses. A Hutan Desa license allows a village as the smallest administrative level of government the rights to manage their forest. Hutan Desa can be used for collection of NTFPs, non-timber forest products, or the use of ecosystem services, or even limited logging. NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and Fauna and Flora International have been working across Indonesia to secure Hutan Desa permits and participatory conservation agreements for communities. Alternatively to Hutan Desa, the company could support the communities to develop a sustainable forest management cooperative. The cooperative can then apply for Hutan Kemasyarakatan. Under this social forestry permit, the World Agroforestry Centre, ICRAF, supported communities to secure rights to over 13,000 hectares of buffer zone of a protected forest in Lampung. The cooperative here now is growing sustainable forest products such as coffee whilst protecting the forest from encroachment. If the community land is on APL, then the community needs to register their lands with the district government as private land ownership. Under this, they should be able to protect their HCV or HCS area. For any one of these social forestry options, the company could support the mapping and the development of management plans for community land. These plans could then be sent to the district government in an application for the Village Fund. Through this, villages can receive up to $65,000. This is a significant amount, and the fund can therefore be used as a great incentive or an entry point to participatory conservation planning and sustainable development. The company could also help communities in finding additional financial support for their sustainable management plans, such as REDD+ or forest conservation funds. So those are some of the options if the community does wish to manage the area. However, if the community does not wish to manage the land, then the company should seek options to protect the area from within the HAGAU itself, under the management of the company. For these options, we need to follow the decision tree to the second page. So the simplest possible way of getting an area protected inside the HAGAU is if that area is classified as protected peat under the KLHK's National Peat Ecosystem Function Map. If this is the case, the company is actually obliged to protect the area, and they're obliged to submit maps along with management and monitoring plans to the local KLHK peat representative. If the peat area exceeds 40% of the concession, the company may be able to apply for a land swap, and we'll come to land swaps in the last page of the decision tree. If the area for protection is not considered protected peat by the KLHK, the next best solution is to try to register the area as set aside within the HAGAU itself, under the active management of the company. To do this, the company will need to make the case that the protection of these areas is integral to the functioning of the palm oil concession. The AMDAL report, supplemented by an HCV/HCS assessment report, along with a management and monitoring plan, relevant protective regulations, and an explanation that market demands and companies' commitments require the protection of the area, should all be provided to the local BPN head. An analysis of existing regulations that mandate the protection of various HCVs and HCS forests can be found in the research paper. There is a well-known decree that limits this type of conservation area to 10 to 15% of the concession area, KLHK Decree No. 17, 1995. Sanctions for breaking this decree have in the past included repossession of the area as idle land by the BPN. However, it's believed that multiple concessions have worked around this decree and protected over the 15%. One recommendation would be to compile a list of case studies of these concessions to understand better how these were achieved. If the company does successfully manage to get this area under protection, local communities Dinas Kehutanan dan Perkebunan and BKSDA should be informed, and a biannual reporting system should be set up to regularly inform these government bodies and communities of the area's status and the progress. If protecting the area as set aside within the concession is not possible, another consideration would be to pursue the Kawasan Ecosystem Essential route. The Kawasan Ecosystem Essential, or CARA program, allows for a protection zone within APL recognised at the district and provincial levels and co-managed by multiple stakeholders. This program is intended for the protection of areas of species, protected species corridors, or essential ecosystem functions significant at the landscape level on APL land. The application for a CARA program is lodged with the Governor and Bupati and supervised by the KLHK. Underpinning the CARA regulations are new supporting land swap mechanisms. These could be employed in scenarios where a local government was reluctant to give up too much productive APL land. Again, we're going to come back to land swaps at the end. The research found 2 case studies for CARA, one in West and one in East Kalimantan. In East Kalimantan, the Nature Conservancy supported the application of a CARA program in 2016 for over 500,000 hectares of land, home to over 2,500 protected Bornean orangutans. This area is also critical for carbon sequestration and other ecosystem functions. At the time of writing the paper, TNC were also applying for restoration licenses for this land and developing educational programs for local people. In West Kalimantan, the Sustainable Trade Initiative IDH supported 3 companies in developing a CARA program across a corridor of peat and riparian forests and Gunung Palung National Park. The CARA area here is so large that it overlaps 3 separate districts and is now the platform for an alternative livelihoods and best agricultural practices training program for local communities. Okay, so if communities are not interested in managing the area and the company cannot keep the area inside the HAGAU as set aside or CARA, the company may have to excise the area from the HGU. However, this should not be a point at which the company just relinquishes all responsibility for the forest or HCV. This third page of the decision tree delineates a company's options in protecting land outside of community or company management. The first option is that the company can negotiate an enclave area with local BPN and Bupati. Essentially, this is a way to protect a section of APL land under the management of the district government. The enclave option is directly under district regulations, meaning there could be as many as 200 ways to enact an enclave designation, and there's very little information available to support a company in applying for this. However, for the very reason that it does exist under district regulations and only requires that the Bupati approves it, this may be a swift option for securing protection. Through researching this paper, I found 3 separate institutions that successfully enacted an enclave option, including Fauna and Flora in West Kalimantan, Kutai Kartanegara District Government in East Kalimantan, and PT Cal Company in West Kalimantan. A comparison study of these cases and any other examples is highly recommended to better understand the mechanisms to apply for this type of protection. If an enclave option is not possible, the next best line of action would be to pursue conversion of the area to Kawasan Hooten. Now, this is called a forest gazettement, and historically this process has been time-consuming and complicated for companies with unpredictable costs and outcomes. However, as Kawasan Hooten law is designed to allow for protection options, it's arguably one of the best avenues for long-term protection. As mentioned previously though, APL land is often viewed by governments through its ability to generate profit and tax revenues, and Kawasan Hooten is ultimately viewed as less profitable than APL. Thus, local government may feel a lot of pressure not to convert APL back into Kawasan Hooten. To expedite this process, one option is to implement a land swap. Essentially, finding a similarly sized area of degraded Kawasan Hooten to swap with the forested APL land, so there is no net loss of APL. To do this, the company would need to lead a study into the communities, permits and conditions of the Kawasan Hooten land to ensure there's a minimal impact on any communities or HCVs found there. To my knowledge, this has never been implemented successfully before. However, with the new regulations being brought out to underpin Kawasan Ecosystem Essential, forest swaps may become simpler and more achievable for companies in the future. The current clearest route for implementing a forest swap is to influence the district spatial planning revision process. And there are some existing regulations that companies and government can use to guide them in the ratios for Kawasan Hooten to APL, depending on what percentage of the province is already Kawasan Hooten. But the company has to be realistic about timeframes here, especially if they're under pressure from investors to start development. If the company is successful in converting the area to Kawasan Hooten, the area will automatically fall under the management of the KPH, or Forest Management Unit. This is the de facto KLHK management unit for Kawasan Hooten with no existing permits. KPH is another one of Jokowi's government's new initiatives, with the aim of improving forest governance. But KPH will not necessarily guarantee the area's protection, as KLHK could still designate the area as production forest based on their scoring system that looks at slope and soil type and rainfall. As such, it's recommended that the company then works with local stakeholders like NGOs, communities and government, as well as the KPH, to promote the active management and protection of the area. If none of the above options are available to secure the protection of this land, one final suggestion would be to compile all the evidence for the protection value of the area, the AMDAL supplemented by HCV and HCS reports, along with a list of laws supporting the protection of this area. This argument in support of protection could then be presented to the governor as a basis for altering the provincial spatial plans. So, what are the key takeaways from this webinar? Well, our approach to this decision tree and our advice to companies is to really place those local communities in the driving seat for protecting areas, following the principles of free, prior and informed consent. Ultimately, they're always going to be the best custodians for this land long term, So it's critical to get their buy-in and ideally support them with the resources that they need to manage the land. Crucially, with the decision tree, we really wanted to show that there are already options available in the existing regulations for getting HCV areas and HCS forests found in palm oil estates under legal protection. Many of these options are currently convoluted and really difficult to achieve, and there's not that many successful examples out there yet. However, with the rolling out of new regulations and initiatives like social forestry, Kawasan ecosystem essential, peat regulations, and the new CAPA, we believe that these options will become simpler and easier for companies to adopt. We hope that companies and even NGOs and communities will use this research to guide them in getting these areas under legal protection and fuel a kind of Cambrian explosion of positive case studies for others to draw guidance from. For more details on all of this and to really get more information on this webinar, we encourage you to read the original research. Thank you for watching this webinar and good luck with your conservation aims.